Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for September 24th, 2022, around 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot to talk about today, including the threat for a major hurricane landfall somewhere in the Florida Panhandle or Peninsula over the next couple of days. So let's go and jump straight into everything. Taking a wide look across the tropical Atlantic this afternoon, we noticed that several systems are still on the board today. For the main focus of today's video, we are going to be talking about Tropical Storm Ian, which is now to the southeast of Jamaica. If we take a look here at the visible satellite imagery for this system, we notice that today it looks much better organized compared to the last couple of days, with deep organized convection now persisting around a common axis or a common center at this particular point. And if we jump out here to the zoomed out satellite, we notice that we have a much better defined structure and not a lot of vertical shear still over top of our system. And in fact, you kind of notice that we have this expanding outflow that is beginning to take place here. This basically means that environmental conditions will become extremely favorable for additional intensification as this moves westward and eventually curves northwestward over the next couple of days, moving towards the western tip of Cuba here. Now, if we take a look here at the recon plane that's been sampling the storm today, we notice that the structure is still not overly defined. There was a center of circulation defined by the recon plane that was located somewhere in here around 14 degrees north and very close to about 75.5 degrees west. Now, whether or not this is a true circulation or whether or not there's a circulation deeper into this convective mass over here to the northwest remains to be seen, but this is a pretty common fixed pattern for what a low-level circulation would look like. So this may in fact be our dominant circulation trying to take place. Still not really finding much in the way of tropical storm force winds here, very weak winds here on the southern side. So this has a little bit of ways to go left with an organization before it can start to rapidly intensify, but conditions do favor additional intensification throughout the next several days. Now, if we look here at the official track forecast from the National Hurricane Center, again, this is a tropical storm and is expected to begin intensifying within the next about 12 hours. Again, we'll see if that actually happens or not. It's going to be a little bit hard right now given the current structure, but nonetheless, some intensification is possible over the next about 12 to 24 hours. Once this gets south of Jamaica, though, we are likely to start to see this ramp up. We do have a tropical storm watch for the island of Jamaica and a hurricane watch for the Cayman Islands at this particular point. Again, this continues to move off towards the west and bends northwest as it begins rapidly intensifying and could be a major hurricane in this corridor here as it approaches the western tip of Cuba. Now, this track forecast down here is pretty solid. We understand what the environment and what the track is likely to do for the next about 48 hours or so. However, after that time, the environmental conditions and the overall steering pattern becomes a bit murky. We notice that this begins to turn northeast and eventually makes its way towards the Florida Peninsula or the Big Bend region somewhere near Cedar Key and north of Tampa by Wednesday into Thursday. Now, the cone of uncertainty does extend pretty far out. This goes to about the western edge of Florida into portions of Georgia and all the way just to the north of Miami proper at this point. So there's a very large spread here. Now, the overall risk impact, especially for Florida here and portions of the southeast U.S., again, right now, this is very subject to change, but this is based on the official forecast. This will be coming in at an angle like this. And so there will be the potential for some significant impacts really from about Sarasota all the way down there to near Tampa, kind of towards the north and around the center from where it could be. Of course, an elevated risk all the way to the Georgia-South Carolina border and then down portions of the Florida Peninsula at this particular point. Now, this is likely to change based on some of the latest guidance that we've seen and some additional track forecasts that end up changing over the next couple of days. But right now, the impact risk is significant because of the heavy rainfall, wind, and storm surge issues, and these could either be elevated or subtracted in later outlooks. Now, if I look at the HWRF forecast here and how strong this system could get, we actually will look here at a tweet from Trace Jones here, FL Weather _WX. Again, great, phenomenal person, knows a lot about weather. Even he indicates that it is a primed environment for rapid intensification, very low shear, deep upper ocean heat content, and great outflow. And we can see this here depicted in the HWARF forecast. This is the 060 run here value for 5 a.m. this morning. We'll go ahead and run this out in time. Now, we're still dealing with a little bit of shear today. Again, the shear is not zero today, but it is weaker than what it has been. And this will continue to only decline as time goes on. So by the time we get to about 42 hours from now, we end up with a storm pretty far south of Jamaica. And in fact, we may even see the tropical cyclone advisories for Jamaica, the tropical storm watch actually canceled for Jamaica. That is entirely possible. But nonetheless, we see the storm beginning to gain latitude as it moves off towards the north here and west. Again, there's this little slim ridge over here that will be degraded over the next few days, and this is going to allow our storm to begin pulling northward with time. And now we notice that, again, the storm rapidly explodes given the favorable environment, and we end up with a major hurricane on the western tip of Cuba, the far western tip of Cuba, within about 75 hours from now. This is 5 a.m. Tuesday morning. And then this continues into the Gulf of Mexico, where initially intensification looks likely into the far southern Gulf. But as you start getting further north into the northern Gulf, what you end up getting here is a trough that digs down here. And this trough ends up kind of shearing our storm with that southwesterly shear over top of the system. And so this actually forces a lot of dry air to wrap around the circulation and choke the environment off. And the 60 run, this is still a pretty potent hurricane, but some of the GFS indicators even bring this to very low-end Category 1 or potentially even a tropical storm that makes landfall in the Florida Big Bend region or Panhandle sometime by next week. Now, on this particular run here of the HWARF, we notice that this is still a pretty potent hurricane, 948, just sitting offshore. Some of the latest guidance, again, here, this is the HMON 12Z forecast, again, basically brings us close to Category 5 intensity, 131 knots. So we're closing in on upper end Cat 4, low end Cat 5 intensity in the southern Gulf. This again eventually begins to move northward here. We end up with a storm that is rapidly filling. We notice goes from about 958 to 965. And we end up kind of following much of the GFS solution where this rapidly fills as it approaches landfall, and that wind significantly degrades because of the high shear. Now, the HWARF forecast is a little bit less bullish on that happening. Again, it goes for a storm that is trying to at least maintain intensity as it makes landfall somewhere in the Florida Big Bend region. Again, the track forecast is very uncertain, and the reason for that, this is the 60 run of the GFS here. We're looking at the 500 millibar geopotential heights, and this is the forecast hour for 108. So this is by 2 p.m. next Wednesday. We notice where we have the tropical cyclone located in the forecast model, a pretty good ways away from the Tampa Bay vicinity. Now, one of the things here is that we have this trough that is digging in, and usually, again, these troughs that end up digging in, they dig in and then they get on out of there and they move eastward. And some of the forecasts have either indicated, especially like the European, for example, indicated the backside of this trough actually digs in on the backside of this moving out trough, this departing trough. And so that one digs in and pulls this thing northward towards the Florida Peninsula. But we can see even the run-to-run differences even on the GFS, because this is the 60 run, that's the 12Z run. So the entire orientation of this trough is way different. And now it brings a trough that instead of being over here, it's more so over here. And that matters a lot with our placement of the tropical cyclone, because if we have a system that is not able to catch this trough and the backside doesn't dig in, it will move further westward. And again, this has kind of been indicated by most of the guidance over the past couple of days. If we look here at the 12Z initialized runs here, again, most of the forecast models continue to bring this further towards the north. Again, the UK Met and HMON forecasts from earlier this morning, again, were kind of the only ones that were bringing this over portions of the Florida Peninsula. Most of them, including the GFS and CMC models, were taking this completely and the H-War for that matter, were completely taking this over the Florida Panhandle. So there's a lot of differences here, and we can see this in the GFS ensembles. Again, most of the ensemble members at this point are actually more so pointing towards a Florida Panhandle landfall. Some of them still bring this over the peninsula. There is still a non-zero risk of that. If we look at the ensemble blend, we can see again we have a fairly low spread for the next couple of hours until about the next day. We have fairly good certainty that we're going to have a storm somewhere in there. But then we start to have significant differences with the track and intensity forecasts, as again, this is by hour 108. We have a cluster that begins to take this over the Florida Peninsula, and a cluster that is much further west at this point, even some going as far west as the northeastern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. And so we end up kind of having, there are a pretty significant cluster of members that do carry this inland over the Florida Peninsula. I mean, there's certainly a fairly good, grouping of members. Most of them, though, were actually the European forecast runs. The GFS and others were carrying this more out towards the west, and you can kind of see these differences. And so by day 5, we'll bring this to the day 5 period, you have an ellipse that stretches from just north of the Yucatan all the way to the east coast of Florida. So there's still a lot of uncertainty, and the bottom line is that this track here is likely to change over the next several days. And so it's important to not focus solely on the track as it is, just kind of focusing on, okay, are you inside that cone or not? Because realistically, again, you could have a storm that is, on the far southern end of this cone or the far western end of this cone, closer to the Florida Panhandle and the, borders between Alabama and Florida. So there's a non-zero chance of that. Again, anything that gets too far north, it's going to be a very weak system, more than likely, or weaker as it approaches landfall compared to a system that tries to take a track, something like that, which would be stronger and bring more impacts to the peninsula. So we have a long ways to go. Thankfully, we have upper level reconnaissance and upper level soundings that are going to be increased over the next couple of days to get a better sampling of the storm environment. There is still a non-zero chance that we could have some significant impacts to the Florida Peninsula. However, that seems to be at least decreasing as of today. However, again, do not let your guard down, and anywhere within this cone of uncertainty needs to continue monitoring the progress of this system. And even if you live on the edges of this cone here, you still need to be monitoring because, again, things can and will change within 5 to 6 days. We have a long ways to go before we are certain. All right. So that being said, I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and evening. Of course, I am Michael O'Malley. I'll be talking to you guys again some more later this evening.